Hello everyone, I am the Method Kirby, and welcome to my channel, The Commander Tavern. The Commander Tavern is a channel dedicated to my favorite Magic the Gathering format. The Brewery is a series on this channel showcasing my spicy brews under the deck text. On this episode of The Brewery, I'll be discussing my take on a commander recently spoiled from Brothers War, Titania, Voice of Gaea. If you like this deck or any of the cards I'll be mentioning throughout the video, please consider using my TCG Player affiliate link when purchasing those cards. You can find that link down in the description. It'll really help out the channel. But the very best way you can help support the channel is with my Patreon. There are plenty of perks for being a patron, such as early access to certain videos, exclusive deck text, gifts, and more. You could also support my channel for free by simply liking, subscribing, and sharing, which also helps out a lot. I put out a video every Monday, so you don't want to miss out. You can join my Discord server for free if you want to join the Commander Tavern community. All pertinent links are down in the description. Alright, let's get back to the episode. Titania is a 3/4 elemental with reach for 1 generic and 2 green. She has a triggered ability that gains you 2 life whenever 1 or more land cards are put into your graveyard from anywhere. This ability not only entices you to play lands with a built-in sacrifice outlet, but other cards that sacrifice lands. The payoff is her third ability, which triggers during your upkeep. That's because you need 4 lands in your graveyard as well as controlling Argoth, Sanctum of Nature. While this land isn't really anything to write home about, it does help get lands into your graveyard by potentially self-milling them. However, I don't use that ability at all in this deck. In fact, the only reason for running this land is because of Titania's trigger. If you meet the conditions, then you meld Titania and Argoth into Titania Gaea Incarnate, a star elemental avatar with vigilance, reach, trample, and haste, whose power and toughness are each equal to the number of lands you control. If that weren't enough, when she enters the battlefield, you get to put all the land cards from your graveyard onto the battlefield tapped. On its own, these are amazing stats that give Melding Titania the potential to one-shot an opponent with commander damage. Keep in mind that since she's melded from your commander, she also has the commander status. On top of this, she can also put 4 +1/+1 counters on a land you control, making it a 0/0 elemental with haste. So she's also an amazing mana sink for all of those lands we'll be playing. It should be noted that unlike previous meld commanders like Brisella, Voice of Nightmares, it's actually incredibly easy to get Argoth while having Titania in the command zone, since green has access to non-basic land tutors. Expedition Map, Sylvan Scrying, Template Discovery, Hour of Promise, and Elvish Reclaimer are just 5 examples. While the last 3 are much better since they put the tutor land directly onto the battlefield, Elvish Reclaimer is the absolute best of all of them because you have to sacrifice a land to activate it, thus providing a land sacrifice outlet, helping to get lands in the graveyard for Titania's meld trigger. This is incremental value you can keep using, which is absolutely insane. Definitely an auto include here. The first 2 aren't that bad even though the land goes to your hand because they're so cheap to cast. In fact, you can tutor for Expedition Map itself thanks to Urza Saga, which can tutor for it straight to the battlefield when you get to the last chapter. And since it's a land, it's also going to the graveyard afterwards, which Titania loves. The Saga is also amazing at getting Amulet of Vigor onto the battlefield. This artifact does a ton of work in the deck since almost all ramp effects have the lands enter the battlefield tapped. Besides Titania melding, the deck does have other ways of recurring lands, which we'll soon see. So recurring Urza Saga is great at getting more use out of it, even if the final iteration is getting just Soul Ring, the deck's only mana rock. You could also include Jewel Lotus if you wanted to get a turn 1 Titania, but that's not really necessary since the meld trigger requires much more setup than that. Root Path Purifier, an absolutely insane card, is another way of helping us find Argoth. This is because it gives all of the lands we control and in our library the basic super type. This means that you could very easily tutor for Argoth with Rampant Growth, Cultivate, and Kodama's Reach. And not just Argoth, but any land in the deck. So if you already have Argoth, you could get any other utility land. These spells are so good on their own since they also help ramp the deck. But with Root Path Purifier, they will also get us Argoth. Same with basic land ramp lands like Evolving Wilds, Terramorphic Expanse, Fabled Passage, and Prismatic Vista. Since these ramp for a basic land, without specifying basic land type, controlling Root Path Purifier while cracking these means getting any land from our library straight onto the battlefield, thus giving us even more ways of getting Argoth. And they're still good on their own for thinning the deck of basic forests. Even Blighted Woodland works with Root Path Purifier since it doesn't specify basic land type. Best of all, these lands also synergize with Titania herself, so it's win-win-win. However, it should be noted that this will not work with the rest of the fetch lands of the deck, these being the 3 Panoramas, the Streets of New Capenna fetch lands, and the modern staple fetches. This is because these do specify basic land type. So even though the Panoramas and New Capenna fetches mention the basic super type, it's followed by a basic land subtype. The modern fetches don't even get basic lands. All that being said, these are still incredibly useful for not only thinning the deck of lands, but upping the land count in our graveyard as well as helping trigger our landfall effects as often as possible. But we'll see those effects later on. At the very least, the modern fetch lands can get Dryad Arbor onto the battlefield for that surprise chump block if you're into those pro gamer moves. In fact, chump blocking with Dryad Arbor is another way of getting lands into our graveyard. Thanks to lands like Yamamaya Cradle of Growth, we can also just tap down these fetch lands for mana if we've run out of basic lands to ramp for. The deck is running 11 basic forests, and since we're so constantly recur these fetch lands, we'll fin our deck of lands in no time. But Yamamaya still gives life to those fetch lands that don't tap for mana, so it's win-win-win with our mana base. In fact, Yamamaya is a great way to make it easier to turn Wood Elemental into an epic sacrifice outlet. This card is lauded as one of the worst cards in Magic, but thanks to decks like these, this card is actually pretty good, and will get you quite the kudos from your pod when playing it successfully. It provides a massive land sacrifice trigger to then be a huge beater. Patron of the Orochi is another card that makes full advantage of Yamamaya as well. Being able to untap not only all of our green creatures but our lands provides so much value, not just mana acceleration but giving our green attackers pseudo vigilance, etc. Best of all, we can tap all of our forests down for mana before untapping them and then sacrificing them all to Wood Elemental, so there's a ton of synergy abound here. But we'll see all of the land synergies of the deck soon. Going back to non-basic land ramp, and saving the best for last, is Scape Shift, possibly the best land-based ramp effect for this commander. Not only does it get you any land from your library straight to your battlefield, but the amount is limited only by how many lands you sacrifice when it resolves, thus also getting lands into the graveyard for Titania. Since it costs 4 to cast, if you sacrifice those 4 lands upon resolution, that's already meeting the 4 lands in the graveyard requirement as well as getting Argoth onto the battlefield. It's also done on curve. You cast Titania and then next turn Scape Shift. Then in your next turn she melds. Absolutely worth a slot here. While sacrificing our lands might seem like a huge drawback, keep in mind that once Titania returns to the battlefield melded, she'll put all of the lands from our battlefield from our graveyard. So you might actually want to do that in order to trigger all the landfall effects in the deck. Or you might do it consistently over time for value. Crucible of Wards, Wommanap Excavator, and Ancient Green Warden help in that aspect since we can replay fetch lands or any other lands with built-in sacrifice effects right from our graveyard. While this might seem like it'll slow down Melding Titania, it'll help us tremendously with never missing our land drops, thinning the deck of lands, and triggering those landfall effects multiple times in a turn, or at instant speed for those pro-gamer moves. Ancient Green Warden also has the added bonus of having a sort of Panharmonicon effect for lands, giving us double landfall triggers. Amazing. Splendid Reclamation is a one-time use only kind of deal, but it does return all of our lands from our graveyard right to the battlefield. This card is great at any point of the game since we can turn all of our fetch lands, all forest sacrifices to Wood Elemental, etc. It's just too good not to run here. Besides replaying lands from the graveyard to never miss a land drop, we can also play multiple lands per turn thanks to Azusa Lost Seeking, Dryad of the Elysian Grove, Oracle of Moldiah, Wayward Swordtooth, Druid Class, Exploration, Storm Cauldron, and Burgeoning. Azusa is the only one that lets us play more than one extra land per turn, but combining these others obviously gives us tremendous advantage, especially if we have any of the previously mentioned 3 cards that let us play lands from our graveyard. Being able to crack a fetch land multiple times per turn is no joke, especially with the landfall effects in the deck. Dryad of the Elysian Grove is amazing because it provides another Yamamaya/Urborg effect, giving all of our lands all basic land types, letting us tap down fetches and other utility lands for mana. Storm Cauldron is my favorite of these though because this is so backbreakingly oppressive when used asymmetrically. The effect does affect all players, but we're prepared for the drawback by playing multiple lands per turn. So we're not that set back from tapping lands for mana. Our opponents will suffer that though, and thanks to Burgeoning, each time our opponents have their lands bounced and then they play them again, since they can play 2 per turn, we'll also drop 2 lands from our hand. If this happens all the way around the table, we can drop up to 6 lands before it's our turn again, making Storm Cauldron more of an asset than a detriment, especially when we have landfall triggers on the board. Cultivator Colossus is another way to drop a ton of lands from our hand, but we need to have a ton of lands in our hand. So whether they got there because we drew and traded a ton of cards or bounced a ton of lands, this thing is insane when it hits the battlefield. If that weren't enough, its power and toughness is equal to the number of lands you control, and it has trample. This thing has the potential to end games here. Red 7 can also help us drop all of our lands in our hand at once thanks to her 0 loyal ability. Since we don't lose loyalty, we can do this each turn. Imagine activating this ability when we have Storm Cauldron in play. Super busted. Her +1 ability isn't that good here though, since we're milling away everything revealed that isn't a land, so it does not help trigger Titania's meld effect. Her -3 ability is super good though, but use it only in case of emergencies since it won't be easy to give her loyalty counters. Her emblem isn't that important to get, so if you only use Red 7 for dropping lands from your hand with the occasional beefy Treefolk token, it's all good. As for the landfall abilities in the deck, let's start with the best ones, the ones that draw us cards. Seer Sundial, Tireless Tracker, and Nissa Vital Force have such landfall abilities. Well, somewhat. The Sundial requires we pay 2 generic mana each time, which isn't that big of an issue since the deck generates so much mana. Same with Tireless Tracker, since it creates a clue token with its Landfall trigger. That's also too generic that we have to pay, but at least we can pay for it whenever we want instead of at the moment. And whenever we crack a clue, it gets a +1/+1 counter. Nissa doesn't have the Landfall trigger per se, but her emblem does, an emblem that we can get with her surviving just one whole turn around the table. And that +1 ability that gets us there is also great since it untaps a land that we can either use for mana or leave untapped to block, since it becomes a 5/5 until our next end step. The deck still has non-synergistic card draw like Return of the Wild Speaker, Rishkar's Expertise, and Soul's Majesty. Well, I say non-synergistic, but green's card draw is dependent on creatures anyways. However, with the number of creatures in the deck that have variable power and toughness, these spells have the potential of drawing us into an insane number of cards. As always, bonus points for casting either Return of the Wild Speaker or Soul's Majesty off of resolving Rishkar's Expertise. Speaking of creatures, we can create a ton of creatures via Landfall triggers as well. Rampaging Baloths, Avenger of Zendikar, Scoot Swarm, Greensleeves, Marrow Sorcerer, Spore Mound, and Zendikar's Whirl do so quite magnificently. Granted, Avenger of Zendikar doesn't create the tokens via Landfall, but when it itself enters the battlefield, but it can potentially create a metric ton of tokens, which can then get significantly pumped with each land that enters the battlefield under our control. Greensleeves is another one of those creatures with variable power and toughness that I mentioned earlier that becomes quite the beater. Best of all, it has protection from planeswalkers and wizards, which isn't nothing, as niche as it might seem. At least it's flavorful for those Vorthos players. Scoot Swarm becomes absolutely ridiculous here, as with any Landfall deck. I love this little bug because of all of the maths involved. Once you hit 7 lands, this thing gets ridiculous. Even more so if you manage to mutate any of the only mutate creatures in the deck onto it. Sawtusk Demolisher and Gem Grazer are included not only because they're amazing removal effects, but they can give trample to any of those Marrow type creatures with variable power and toughness. Not all of them do, so getting that is epic. Just make sure to mutate beneath the creature, otherwise the power and toughness will be whatever you mutated them with. But as with the renowned Scoot Swarm interaction, getting exponential amounts of 6/6 or 4/4 tramplers with each Landfall trigger can definitely end the game. The deck is still running non-synergistic interaction though, like Force of Vigor, Beast Within, Spine of Ishsa, Meteor Golem, Scour from Existence, and Introduction to Annihilation. It's not like we have much in the way of counter magic, but at least we can deal with it once it hits the battlefield. A lot of these seem a bit overcosted, but in a mono-green deck like this one, it's not that big of a deal. While I'm on the topic of interaction, Ghost Quarter, Strip Mine, and Wasteland are amazing here. Not only do these lands have a built-in sacrifice outlet, much to Titania's benefit, but they can also get rid of any annoying lands, especially those that can remove Titania or any other fatty from combat, or just any land altogether. Do keep in mind that with the amount of land recursion and extra land playing in the deck, any of these could very easily turn into depriving your opponents of keeping any of their lands onto the battlefield. So how evil you choose to be with them is up to you. Speaking of blowing up lands, Titania Protector of Argoth and Turn Timber Sower have an amazing land-based trigger that occurs when lands hit the graveyard. While Titania only triggers when our lands hit the graveyard from the battlefield, Turn Timber Sower triggers whenever our land hits the graveyard from anywhere, even our library or hand. With these on the battlefield, you can get even more triggers out of consistently cracking fetch lands. Unlike Titania's beefy 5/3s, Turn Timber Sower's tokens might be lowly 0/1s, but they are plants, so they'll also benefit from Avenger of Zendikar since they're essentially the same tokens it creates. Tireless Provisioner also creates tokens via Landfall, but they're either food or treasure tokens. I have almost never created food tokens with it, but sometimes becoming the arch enemy means getting low on life, so you'd be surprised at how creating some food in dire straits can come in quite handy. That being said, definitely create the treasures whenever you have the chance. The mana advantage is too large to take lightly. Ashaya Soul of the Wild is the last card of this section, which might seem like an odd choice at first until you really understand the card. Ashaya gives non-token creatures the land type and forest subtype as additional types. This means that any non-token creature entering the battlefield will trigger all of the landfall effects in the deck, as well as when those creatures die. Not only that, but if all of our creatures are also lands, they will also count towards the power and toughness of those creatures that care about land counts. But wait, there's more. If Titania Gaea Incarnate is also a land, that means that she can pump herself with her own ability, getting 4+1/+1 counters for each 4 mana we sink into it, making her even larger. Who needs huge mechs when you have a towering elemental avatar? Speaking of a towering elemental avatar, the deck makes further use of those beefy creatures. Swiftfoot Boots, Lightning Greaves, Champion's Helm, Commander's Plate, Darksteel Plate, Shield of Kaldra, and Hammer of Nazan can not only help protect Titania, but any key creature as well. Granted, some of these only care about commanders or legendary creatures, like Champion's Helm and Commander's Plate, but Greensleeves, Azusa, Ashaya, etc. are also legendary. It's important to note that if you are using these to protect Titania, when she melds, she has to leave the battlefield. So there is that window of time between her returning to the battlefield and then your draw step and main phase to try and equip them again. Any well-timed Doom Blade will be the end of your mashup. Brass Squire can help with that by being able to attach equipment at instant speed. This might seem like a niche card to add, but you'd be surprised just how good this is in general. You can attach any equipment at instant speed, so any other key creature being targeted can be protected by swapping that equipment at instant speed. Sylvan Safekeeper can also help protect our key creatures at instant speed and for no investment in mana as well. Better yet, you need to sacrifice a land to activate it. This further synergizes with the deck. Not only do we have a free instant speed sacrifice outlet for lands, but it can give Shroud to any of our creatures at instant speed. So good. The deck is still running cards like Heroic Intervention and Rampant Vigor to provide more instant speed responses that aren't purely synergistic. Fortunately, very few board wipes have the can't be regenerated clause, so Rampant Vigor is so much better than you might think. It's no Heroic Intervention, but there's a reason one is rare while the other is common. While we've seen that the deck can seamlessly go wide as well as tall, there are a couple of cards that can help it benefit from both. Equipping Scepter of Celebration to a huge fatty will create a metric ton of 1/1 citizens upon connecting, and it'll more than likely connect since the Scepter not only gives a +2/+0 boost, but trample too. Super busted. Nylea, God of the Hunt, also gives trample, but to our entire board. She's also indestructible, making her very hard to get rid of. If that weren't enough, she also has a built-in mana sink that pumps a creature +2/+2 each time, which is great at pumping Titania in response to combat damage to potentially get that commander damage win. Or just activate Rogue's Passage. Trample is great and all, but unblockability is better. Best of all, we have ways of tutoring for this land too, just in case we want to guarantee that commander damage win. Or making any other star creature unblockable. This brew is just an idea of how to build around Titania Voice of Gaea. Monogreen decks have no shortage of powerful effects, but the most powerful tend to be around lands, especially considering how insanely easy it is to ramp for. While I built Titania in such a way as to make the most of her abilities as well as going wide and or tall, you can realistically take her in any other direction, and probably still get a decent deck because good stuff monogreen deck is a thing. If you're interested in the deck list of this spicy brew of mine, you can find a link to it down in the description. I would like to thank all my patrons for supporting me, and a quick shout out to all my higher tier patrons, the Brewers, for their patronage. I'd also like to thank anyone using my CCG player affiliate link, that also helps out the channel. And to everyone, thanks for watching this episode of the Brewery on the Commander Tavern. I'm the Meld Kirby, and happy brewing.